Welcome to the PROUT Cafe. I'm here recording an interview with Ravi Logan, who is an expert on PROUT, and we'll be finding out more about the topic and also his connection to it. I'm Sophie. I'll be your host, and maybe we can all introduce ourselves.
I'm Asha. I'm here in Eugene, located in the same place as Ravi Logan. Also, feel I should mention I am his daughter, so that's a fun connection.
I'm Tasha. I am in Baltimore, Maryland.
And I'm Lidica. I'm also in Eugene, Oregon.
And I'm coming at you from Cleveland, Ohio. So, Ravi, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is how did you get involved in Prout? When did you first find the philosophy?
There's a big version, a short version of that. I might come in somewhere in between. The 1960s, late 1960s were a very formative time for me, in that I was immersed in a culture of social and political, cultural upheaval in the country, and became keenly sensitized to the need for an American society that was more inclusive and that disengaged from wars that were at least partially motivated by economic imperialism and efforts at global hegemony, and a world in which there would be preservation of the global commons, the natural environment. So there were diversity of issues in all of these arenas. And as well, there was a sense that the dominant culture was one that was very deadening to the creativity and the deeper spiritual sensibilities latent in the human being. So in addition to so much happening at political and social levels, there was also cultural revolution. I had intense involvement in that. Kind of a culminating point was being on the streets of Berkeley in 1969 during the People's Park uprising. One day when I was out in the street, there was live ammunition used under the order of probably Governor Reagan. There were people who went down, and this massive show of forces of the state. A couple months from then, I was headed for a commune in a remote corner of Washington state. And a lot of my attention had shifted toward a more inward revolution. I eventually ended up on an island, remote island off the coast of British Columbia, with a box of books that were on topics related to humanity's perennial wisdom traditions. Spent a winter going through those. A letter came one day that there was a yogi from India passing through Eugene, offering instruction and meditation. And I developed a longing to explore inwardly. And the draft board was making its third attempt to induct me into the Indochina fight in the Indochina War. I had to go back and deal with that. My dad was dying of a brain tumor. So I made a 2-day journey to Seattle. And during that time, I got a instruction in a meditation practice, which I followed since. But when I was there, the yogi who was passing through was featured at a retreat, a weekend retreat that I went to. In the course of one of his presentations, he made side mention that his spiritual preceptor had given a social theory. And then he just rattled off these 5 basic principles of this theory. I had such a sophisticated knowledge of political ideology by that time. I recognized that there was tremendous depth inherent in these principles. And the fact that on the one hand, I was there exploring a practice that would give me deeper knowledge of self, but on the other hand, I was getting it from someone who had an awareness of the need for transformation of the society, such that it brought together these two important thrusts towards liberation that I had passion about, was very significant. And I began to look into it, and I found that the theory that social theory he was referring to, was PROUT. So I became the earliest student of PROUT, really, in North America, and the earliest proponent of it. Such was my origins, the origins of my relationship to this theory.
Will you name who that yogi was who first taught you?
Well, he was not the one I learned from. I heard it mentioned first from him. His name was Dada Vimalananda Avadhuta, but he himself had gotten exposure to it from his own preceptor, his own master, Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, who is a very interesting kind of Renaissance personality. He was both a highly evolved, fully realized spiritual personality, as well as having almost unfathomable depth of knowledge about mundane aspects of human life, and had capacity to speak on a wide range of subjects with great insight and authority. And as well, he dedicated himself to the project of training and uplifting individuals and inspiring them to engage in social transformation. A social transformation that had as its fundamental value a recognition of the inherent dignity of each and every human being and of all life forms, so that he went up against so much religious dogma, as well as going up against political dogmas of capitalism and communism. And that put him in the crosshairs of those who had vested interests. And he eventually spent nearly 8.5 years in jail, solitary confinement, several attempts on his life. But through it all, he did not compromise his values, his integrity, his commitment to this human cause. That inspired me. In fact, I made a journey to India at one point and I was able to attain the security clearance to get into the jail where he was being held, and was able to have an audience with him for about 20 minutes. It was deeply moving. Yeah, but I digress.
I'm wondering, I have questions about the the story of visiting him in jail, because I remember you telling me that before, but maybe that's a little off topic. Anyway, I guess I wanna ask, you mentioned like the political dogmas of capitalism and communism. How do you see this as a viable kind of non-dogmatic alternative?
That's of course a big subject, but one dimension along which I would highlight the distinction is that, as you know, capitalism privileges individual interests. In North America at this time, individual interests holds such a privileged place that has probably never been seen before in human history. All other societies have been much more collectivist. Communism, on the other hand, at least as it got expressed in communist-run governments, placed an equally extreme emphasis on collective interest, or state interest in practicality often. The aspirations of individuals, their capacity to develop themselves in personal life was often highly suppressed. There was quite little freedom. PROUT kind of comes down the middle, but in a way that integrates the truth of both sides. The truth on the one side is that society is only so strong as it develops the strength of the individuals within it. And individuals are only so strong as they are able to benefit from what is offered by a developed, strong society. So individuals must have interest in the development of the society, and the society must have interest in the development of individuals. There is an interdependent interest that exists there. So that is one dimension in which PROUT contrasts with both capitalism and communism. Another significant dimension, and maybe I'll leave it at this for now, is that both capitalism and communism, there is the concentration of power at higher levels. In the case of capitalism, the power tends to be concentrated in large transnational corporations, financial institutions. With communism, the concentration of power is in the state, and policies are developed that tend to benefit those power arrangements. PROUT proposes a system of economic democracy that decentralizes economic power. And if you decentralize economic power, you both diminish the capacity for the lawless behavior of the transnational corporations. And you also undercut the tendency of political power to be concentrated, because concentration of political power is dependent upon the concentration of economic power. It is the big economic actors that donate heavily to political candidates so that they feel much interest in supporting the corporations. So economic democracy decentralizes economic power, which has the subsidiary effect of decentralizing political power. And what that all accomplishes is a tremendous empowerment of people, local actors, local communities, and local businesses and local individuals. So there is a diminishing of the alienation of life that we feel due to our disempowerment in so many respects and the paradigm of society that comes out of both capitalism and communism.
I guess I want to hear more about where you're coming from philosophically. You said that when you first heard about this, you had a pretty well developed idea of American politics and politics in general. At that time in your life, what was your experience and I guess your background in political organizing?
Well, as I mentioned, I spent much of the late 60s involved with political dissent. I was at one point vice president of SDS, Students for Democratic Society at the University of Washington. I did work with the local draft resistance organization. I also worked with SDS on the Berkeley campus, and was a little more involved in kind of some cultural activism by the time of the People's Park movement. So it focused around anti-war activity and student empowerment activity, though I was deeply aware of the rising aspirations of peoples of color and of women. My philosophical orientation went through a rapid evolution. I explored a lot of political thought and grew in my sophisticated knowledge of it, and tracked as well some of the history of revolutionary movements, because that's what tests theory, is how they bear out in practice. One thing that impressed me was that there were so many dedicated revolutionaries of the last perhaps 3 centuries who did not have the psychological maturity to handle power in the model of what I would call a servant leader. Had dysfunctions of mind that led to their abuse of power. So I recognized, and I was around political movements in which I saw egos, big egos, acting out, and it having harmful effects. So I became increasingly aware that the maturing of the human personality has to be a part of efforts to bring change in the world. That deepened to my sense of needing to know what is the essence of who we are as human beings. And that led to my investigation of spirituality. Broadly, I would say, or one could say, there are three orientations toward worldview. One is the materialist orientation. The second is that of idealism. And the third is that might be called spirituality, but it might also be called kind of humanistic holism. Materialism privileges material reality, that what we can experience with our five senses is what constitutes reality. Idealism privileges ideas and ideals, but it capitulates to existing in a bit of unrealism. There's not appreciation for the material factors that drive social dynamics at times. So both of them, to the extent that they underlie political philosophies, they cause distortions. When one has a humanistic holism properly articulated, I think there is the capacity to overcome those defects of materialism and idealism.
I have a few other questions, but I did actually want to circle back around to the story of you visiting Pierre Sarkar in jail, if you're willing to share more with us. Um, I'm just curious what that visit was like and how that came about for you.
Yeah, well, I learned meditation, as I said, in 1970. And the lineage in which the spiritual authority of this meditation tradition came from originated with Pierre Sarkar. And then this social philosophy, which I found answered my deepest dilemmas, issues I'd come across in my experience of political ideologies, that also originated with Pierre Sarkar. And then my youthful idealism that drove so much of my seeking and striving, exploring in life, was increasingly informed by his example and by people who'd had contact with them. So I came to have a real longing to have a direct connection of some kind with the man. He was jailed in early 1972 or late 71, something like that. A couple of years into being in jail, there was an attempted assassination. He was poisoned. In protest of that, and also in protest of brutal treatment of some of his followers during a period of dictatorship in India from about 75 to 77, he undertook a fast. And that fast went on long. It drew a lot of international attention. It eventually went on for over 5 years. So that increased my curiosity about a personality who had such an extent of yogic powers that it could sustain life under harsh conditions of solitary confinement in a unheated, unventilated jail cell. I went to India. Security forces there required to undergo a security check. They obviously there wasn't the computer networking at that time to check my arrest record from my political days. I convinced them that I was involved in psychological research. That was a little bit real. To get money, I would sometimes sign up to be a subject of psychological experiments at the university. And I passed the security test and was, along with another person who'd been working in South Korea, I was taken to the jail cell. I walked in, just a wave of emotion hit me. I started crying. I never didn't know why. I still don't know exactly why, but just some spontaneous emotional expression. And he beckoned me to come near. He was just sitting laying on a platform, though he didn't have a lot of energy from his fast. Still, there was a radiance. I experienced there was nothing in him that gave expression to any indignity about his unjust treatment. all this energy was directed toward me in a way that I experienced as being an expression of love, a deep love. And he beckoned me close, and I told him my name. He said, yes, yes, I know. You're involved with PROUT in North America. He somehow knew me. I was a bit startled, but not totally so, from stories I'd heard. Man of tremendous intuitional capacity. And I was able to ask him, well, what do you think should be the strategy for people involved in PROUT in North America? And I thought he would give some high-sounding, sophisticated political strategy. And he said you should be involved in serving and providing for the needs of people who aren't getting their needs met. And he said, and there are underserved groups, underprivileged groups, and your attention should go to them in particular. That was what he wanted me to take back. And that has resonated in my mind for long. We need to meet the basic needs of those who are most disadvantaged, of those who are not getting their needs met. That is should be our primary motivation. Of course, that leads to other questions as to how to do that and how to practically build a society in which that is structured in. PROUT does not accept the statement in the Bible that the poor will always be with us. We are adamantly determined to see that there is a society where there are no longer poor. A fundamental principle of PROUT is it should be the constitutional right of every single human being on this planet to get their basic needs and amenities met. If they do not, if they lack housing, medical care, food, education, they should be able to sue their concerned government to make those needs available to them. Anyway, I got to ask a couple questions, and my mind was split between thinking, oh, I'm listening to some great strategist like Che Guevara, political strategist, someone, and then the other hand that, oh, I'm experiencing the love of a realized personality. It was a profound experience. At the end, I was walking. Oh, at one point, the guard said, your time is up, you have to go. And Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar looked up at them. He shouted something in Hindi, their language. I didn't know what it was, but they backed up. They were pressed against the wall.
So you
And
still
he
don't know
went
what
on.
he
He
said?
had more to say, and he went on till he finished. And then he said, okay, you see, if I do not let you go soon, then these men, their jobs will be in jeopardy. They will get in trouble. I do not want that. As I was walking out, then he called me back and he said, you should write books about PROUT, books and articles. And I said, yes, yes. And then later in the day, there were 3 other groups that got to go in and have a short personal contact with them. And each of these groups that went in, as they were leaving, he said, tell Ravi that he should write books on PROUT, books and articles. He wanted it deeply impressed on me. That's my story.
And so you have written several
I
books.
I have been. None of them are bestsellers, but maybe some.
How many books do you have out, Ravi?
I have out maybe a couple that are in print and 4 that are out of print, and then I think 6 on my computer that are anywhere from 95 to 99.9% complete. They will be the best of what I've written if I can just get the time to push it over the goal line.
Yeah, where can people find those?
Where do you find books these days? Amazon, I guess.
I guess we can link some of the things in the description so that people can find your books and read more about PROUT.
There's a website you can go to, and I have a section on the website, or we being the PROUT Institute, which is a group that I am affiliated with. There's a page called Learn. And if you go to that page, you'll find a large number of articles on different topics that you may find much more accessible than trying to go through a book. I know people's attention span has shortened in the modern age. I'm
Mine
trying
definitely.
myself, and this is my first baby step into it, to make the transition to a web-based dialogue.
Mhm.
But much in the past has been print, but there's a lot of good articles there.
Great. And
Good internet.
that's at
www.proutinstitute.org.
okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Ravi. I guess I wanted to see if anybody else had any more questions for you.
I have a question. So this is something that we've talked about a bit in our personal discussions, but I think is valuable generally and something to share. And I think you kind of touched on parts of it, but I was just hoping you could briefly talk about your view of spirituality and what that term means to you. Because I think for a lot of people coming in, spirituality can be a very loaded term that a lot of people can associate with like religion and dogmatic religion and religious trauma. And since you mentioned the Bible, talked about your spiritual practice, I was just hoping, because like I've heard you talk about it, and I think it could be really valuable to hear your view of what spirituality at its core means and how that is interpreted by Prout.
Yeah, words and their definitions are important. And a word like spirituality means many different things to different people. For me, spirituality is that which uplifts the human spirit. And what is it that most uplifts the human spirit? It is a connection with love. And that is often deeply engendered when we have a feeling of profound connection with existence, when we have a feeling of connectedness with the whole, because it dissipates a sense of ourselves as being isolated, ego-driven entities. And it can engender a sense of feelings like compassion, empathy, a love that seeks to express itself through respect for all life and an interest in helping living beings in their development. Once we have a world in which these kinds of values become prominent, it will drive a shift in how our institutions function. They will no longer be so driven by motivations of greed and power, but by recognition that we are all a part of a great wholeness of being. And to the extent in our little realm of it, we work together with our families, with our communities, with our bioregions, with our planet to build a future that works for everyone. That becomes spirituality made manifest.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to clarify because I think that was a good question that Asha asked about um, what does that mean? Because I think that when someone's introduced to Prout as a fundamentally spiritual system or something that grew out of spirituality, specifically, like it came from India and you learned about it through a yogi and you were on a spiritual path, I think that there's a lot of people that would not resonate with that. And it's like, hey, I'm just like trying to like pay my bills and maybe I'm a Christian, maybe I'm an atheist, maybe I think there's a lot of people that just like aren't on that wavelength. And you mentioned the three different worldviews or kind of perspectives that you can have as far as materialistic, idealistic, and spiritual. And I think that it's hard for people to piece it like pull apart idealistic and spiritual because a lot of what you're saying sounds like an idea like, yes, no one should be hungry and everyone should have their needs met and everyone should be, full with love for everyone else. And that sounds very idealistic. And to what extent can you participate in this system or work with the system if you don't come from that background or if you have a different if you come from a different worldview or if you're just not does everyone have to do yoga to be part of Prout essentially like what how do we find that connection or that balance?
Yeah. Well, a couple of points I'll make. Good question, sister. There are many who don't resonate with it. You bring up the word spiritual, yeah, because there's been it is kind of on a continuum with religion. And religion in the main, I feel, is an expression of philosophical idealism. And religion contains much which is dogmatic and which leads to separation between people. Though there are higher expressions of religion that certainly I would recognize as being spiritual in nature. Anyway, you say that many wouldn't resonate with the spiritual foundations, but there are many who would. And there are growing numbers of those who would. You find it in Black communities, you find it in Native American communities, you find it among some of the ecofeminists, and you find it among kind of ecological humanists. There is this growing recognition that is leaning toward a holistic viewpoint, a viewpoint that all existence is interconnected, interwoven, interdependent. Look at Gaia theory, the view that life on our planet is one living whole, one fabric of life, that you cannot take pieces out and understand it completely from that perspective. That also leads toward this spiritual humanistic viewpoint. There is a growing buy-in around this worldview. Now, with different people, you may use different terminology. With engaged Buddhists, I use the term radical interdependency. With some ecologists, I might refer to deep ecology's viewpoint of bioequality. With indigenous people, I might term it a little differently. The words and the meaning of the words become important with the communication, the dialogue you're having. And with you all, I took some shortcuts here and didn't get into this kind of specificity, but there is need for that. And I will assert that there is an emergent new worldview that is at least proto-spiritual in nature. There may even be materialists who hold to this worldview. But to the extent that that worldview is one that focuses more and more on holism, to that extent, it begins to capitulate to the mystical worldview of spirituality. Does that speak to your question? I'm sure you would pin me down a little tighter if we had more time for it, but hopefully that speaks a bit to your question.
Yes, it does.
And there are contexts in which I don't emphasize the spirituality. When I talk about the empowerment of communities, I talk about the increased empowerment and respect of disadvantaged groups, inclusivity, things such as this. It is important for humanity now to reach out and find commonality so much as possible without losing a sense of principle.
I'm going to try to pin you down a little bit more on the inclusivity, because all of the groups that you mentioned are kind of more left-leaning, and I am pretty passionate about trying to find middle ground across the whole spectrum. So can you speak to like how you would talk to a conservative Christian about PROUT, and like what might be in it for them? Because I don't want to just try to find I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, there are realistically limits as to how far across the spectrum one can reach. But you mentioned conservative Christians. Let me break that out to conservatives first and then Christians second. If you look into conservatism as in relation to its philosophical origins, and not in relation to how it gets expressed in our polarized society. Conservatism historically was concerned with, it was a bit of a reaction to liberalism, a liberalism that was an economic liberalism that drove economic global expansion. Liberalism was about breaking down trade barriers and regulatory barriers so that there would be a fluid movement of capital on the planet. Conservatism took the viewpoint that one should be careful about how one brings about change, lest one do damage to local communities, to the fabric of local societies. We would include now to the fabric of life on the planet. You all, if you heard conservatism expressed in a classical way, might find much in there you resonate with. You have interest in conserving the environment. You probably would appreciate the importance of conserving local communities, of conserving indigenous traditions that we're sustaining to people. So there is much there that I think common ground with certain classical conservatives could be developed. Regarding Christianity, the trick there would likely be to go back to Jesus, the man, and the example that he set. You know, when he first sent out his core disciples into the surrounding countryside of Galilee, there were two main directives he gave them, or three. One was to live simply, not put on any airs. The second was to bring people together for meals in which all would sit at the table in a circle. The tradition in the imperialistic society of the Roman Empire was when people sat for a meal, the person with the most power was at the head of the table, and then those in the hierarchy of power with increasingly less power would be further away from that person. So the whole structure of power was implicitly present when people sat to eat. And those with the least power, the women, the servants, the slaves, they had their own place where they ate, often the leftovers. So Jesus tried to establish a new patterning that was humanistically inclusive. All came together and sat together, no matter their status. When people sat and ate, status was not a reality. It was just the human beings sharing food together. The second thing was that he asked that they go out and they heal. And in that time, those who were sick were put off they were forced to live on the outskirts of the society. They were ghettoized. They were marginalized. And much of the healing was not so much a healing of their disease, but a healing of their minds and a healing of the social system that brought disrespect to them. So he said, you as a spiritual teacher, you show these people special respect, and not a token respect, but a respect of the heart. And that you work with their inner wounds. What does it mean to be marginalized? To say you are not worthy, to be part of the living society, to share in the benefits, to be able to contribute your human potentialities to the social project. It is deeply wounding at an emotional level. So much of the healing took place at that level, and they would heal their sense of inferiority and bring them into the society. So that was Jesus, the man. It is not the dominant expression of Christianity, but there is a buy-in around the importance of Jesus' example. And if you can speak to that in an effective way, there are those you might reach.
If I could just add on to that too, I think like pretty relevant to your question, Lidika, is the recent success Ravi has had through his writing specifically in converting a libertarian to a neo-humanist who my uncle, who's a somewhat right-wing libertarian, read
Way right wing.
pretty right-wing, yeah, had read one of his books, and it inspired him to treat the natural life surrounding his home that he had kind of viewed previously as an invasion on his space as something that has equal right to be there, and that he now actively works to share the space with and treat with respect. So, you know, I tend to be somebody who's a little pessimistic, but that experience of seeing that shift in somebody did like do a lot to increase my optimism that, you know, there are ways to reach across that. And maybe through writing, maybe conversation sometimes I think have a little more room for emotion, which can make things hard at times. Something I've definitely experienced myself, but the ideas at their core are something that can resonate with people if they can interact with them in a way that feels comfortable to them.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, my brother-in-law, he may become mythic at some point.
I am excited to hear more about his transformation and about the squirrel that he's befriended.
Oh, you've heard, yeah.
Yeah, Madu told me that story. Um, well, I think that's probably all the time we have, but Ravi, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for taking interest. It was nice for me.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.